Hello, everyone. So in this lecture, we're going to talk more about making good arguments and avoiding bad arguments for your argument essay. And today we're going to talk about the problem with common sense. So a risky appeal to common sense. So common sense is generally, it's a good word. We use our common sense to stay out of trouble, to avoid making stupid mistakes. So we see storm clouds coming in. Our common sense says, hey, maybe you should have an umbrella that day, or maybe you should wear a coat or something like that. And generally it works very well. But this is the definition of common sense. It's judgment or your knowledge derived from experience rather than study. So you make a judgment about something based on your previous experience with that and you're thinking about it, but not necessarily on a careful scientific study. So again, for a lot of things in life, this works just great. But sometimes in an academic argument, this can be a problem. So the question is, what is the quality of your experience? So if your experience on that issue is very, very good and rich, then yeah, your common sense can work out well. But on a lot of issues we argue about, we don't have a lot of quality experience. We're kind of guessing. We're kind of guessing what's going to happen to that. The quality is not so good. Do common sense judgments always hold up? Well, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And they kind of surprise people. So here's some examples of the kinds of common sense arguments that you should not make in your paper. And here we go. Thank you, computer. So when you're making a good argument, you need to be careful of unchecked appeals to common sense. You need to make sure that common sense you have is actually accurate. So I have two examples to talk about. The first example we'll talk about is about guns, gun controls. This is an argument that I often hear from people who are in favor of guns, who are pro-guns in the United States. If guns are made illegal, only criminals will have guns. Law-abiding citizens will have no way to protect themselves. The crime rate will inevitably rise. So to some people, this kind of makes sense. If guns are illegal, people like you and me, the good citizens, we don't buy them. We're not criminals. So only the criminals will have guns. We can't protect ourselves. Crime will go up, right? So that, to a lot of people in the United States, that's common sense. But as you'll see on the next slide, when you check it, it might be surprising. Here's another one that we'll look at. The average US teen spends nearly 2 hours a day playing computer games. So that would be the average US teen. Boys tend to play more than that. They're almost 3 hours a day on average. Boys tend to play computer games with graphic violence. And thus, many would be exposed to more than 20 hours a week of violent games. So when boys play computer games, which they do a lot, they play games that have a lot of violence. It's graphic violence. You can see the blood coming out and all that sort of thing. So if these boys are playing these violent games 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, that must affect their brain, right? That's what people would think. How can this not have an effect on their behavior? You play so many violent games, you will become violent. Now again, to some people that seems like common sense. But if you were writing a paper and you just said only something like this about the guns or video games, you would lose some points, because I still would have the question, I know that seems like common sense to you, but is it true? Is there evidence that supports this? And you have to make that extra step. An argument paper, you need to show this is not just my guess of what will happen. We have some research, or we have some evidence. And that's what we'll need to find out, if that is true or not. For some reason, it's always very slow to change the slide. Okay, so here's the one we just talked about. If guns are made illegal, only criminals will have guns, and so on. There can be some evidence to support that. Guns went from legal to illegal in some countries in the past. Australia is the one we're going to talk about. And so there's data to check. We can check this common sense claim. Is it actually true? What does the real world experience say about this? Now, for violent crime in Australia, here's a little bit of background about that. Before 1996, Australians had a lot of gun rights, somewhat similar to the United States. That most adults can buy guns. You don't have to be a policeman, a soldier, that sort of thing. But in 1996, Australia had its worst mass shooting, 36 people killed. So there was an Australian, he went to like a tourist place, and he had a lot of guns, and he killed 36 people, mostly tourists and people who worked there and so on. Now that same year, strict gun controls laws were enacted. So the people were shocked, the governments got angry, and that very same year they made strict gun controls. It's no longer legal to buy the automatic weapons, the weapons that can shoot many bullets in a few seconds. If you want to buy a other gun, you have to have special permission. You have to write some, like a proposal of why you need to have that gun, and the government could say no. And they bought back a lot of guns that people had and so on. So the rate of gun owners really dropped in Australia after that. So this is exactly a case study. People think that if guns are illegal, crime will go up. Well, what happened in Australia? We can check the kind of data here. And then here's the data. So let me get this little pen going here. Here is 1996. Here's the crime rate, 2.0, not really that high, but still, that's what it was. So after 1996 until today, normal people cannot have guns in Australia. They can't get them. What happened to the crime? Well, you can see the crime stayed level for a while, and then roughly 7 years after the law, the violent crime rate went down. Now, why the violent crime rate went down, I'm not sure why, but there's one thing we know from this. Guns were made illegal. The crime rate did not go up. It went down. So that previous common sense thing, it didn't work. Right? If honest people can't buy guns, only criminals have guns, well, it doesn't work that way. And you know, we can guess why. It's difficult for criminals to get guns, or probably it's just mostly that, or that criminals who had guns would get caught and they can't get guns easily again and so on. So anyway, that common sense, it wasn't true. It was not true in Australia. It was not true in England. And so that gun control argument, it's not a valid argument. It seemed like common sense, but it was not. All right. Now back to the violent video games and violent crime. We talked about that already. The amount of violence in video and computer games increased dramatically since the early 90s. So in the early 90s, some of these violent games started to come out, like Doom and so on. And then that number just went higher and higher into the 2000s. More than half of the top 20 best-selling video games today are rated V for violence. So the best-selling video games, most of them, like 11 out of 20, 12 out of 20, are violent games. That's what especially the boys just like. So that's the idea we saw before. Isn't it common sense that this kind of exposure will lead to more violence? They're playing so many games. Well, we have data, right? 1990s is when the violent games started. Did the violence rate go up? We can check this. And as you can probably guess, the answer is no. So here is the early 90s, right when the violent video games were just coming out. And then look at the juvenile. This is for like teenagers and so on. Their crime rate went down. Now, why the crime rate went down? We don't know this. Probably not because of the video games, right? You might think that. You play more violent video games so you don't feel like you need to be violent in the real world. I don't know about that. But one thing we know for sure is They're playing more computer games, but the violent crime rate is going down. It's not having an effect. And this next one shows it a little bit more clearly. Here is the violent crime rate. This begins 1998 all the way to 2015. Yeah, it's just going down, it's going down. This number is the violent video game sales. And you can see from 1998, it just kept going higher and higher and higher. Now it's about plateaued. Now it's not going up. But again, we're watching violent video games go up, the violent crime go down. That common sense did not check out. It seemed like it was good, but when you check the data, it's not true. So our time in check, we'll finish with this. So what you need to be careful for your essay number 4 is that when you make an argument, you make a claim, show some evidence behind that. Don't just guess like, oh, this is common sense. I don't have to prove this. Most of the time you will have to prove it. And then you look at the data. If the data does not support the claim, you have to abandon it. Say, well, it's not an argument I can use. So that's what you need to be careful of. That is it for now. There will be another assignment I'll put up later tonight where I just want to hear some of your answers to what we talked about here today. So make sure you get that done, and then you'll have this video part finished. Right?